Right on time.
All right. So to our ECBS members, welcome. And I'm welcoming our panel members. We have our current New Jersey State Apiarist, Meghan McConnell, and we have our immediate past New Jersey State Apiarist, Tim Schuler, whom I'm sure you are all really happy to see back with us after having had brain surgery a couple of months ago and on his way to being fully recovered, but he's still got a ways to go. We have master beekeepers, 3 of them, I guess 4 if you count me too. We have Kevin Inglin, John Gaut, and Bob Close, all master beekeepers, EAS certified. Grant would have been with us tonight, but for technical difficulties. He's driving down from New York State, so he was unable to get on with his phone for some reason, in spite of Justin trying and Grant trying, but he just couldn't do it. However, I have words of wisdom from him, and I'll pass them on at the appropriate time. The topic of our meeting tonight, our panel, is preparing for winter in summer, getting your bees ready for winter now. And the reason I chose this topic is because in my experience, I found that new beekeepers wait way too late to begin thinking about winter. And every experienced beekeeper that I know and respect who has been doing it for a while and takes good care of his or her bees, has low winter losses, begins to prepare for winter in July, maybe in August. And I thought that it would be valuable to just talk to some of the beekeepers that I respect and see what it is specifically that they do to get bees ready for winter and what's their headset, what's their mind process going on? What are the priorities? What's most important? What do we do first? What do we do next? So with that in mind, let's start. I know Tim may need to leave the discussion a little bit early because he does have, no, maybe not.
Good now. I'm
okay.
Good.
All right. Well, that's great. But we'll start with Tim anyway. Tim, what do you do at this time of year to begin prepping your bees for the winter?
Well, it's kind of what you were talking about earlier. My biggest thing is you can't take anything for granted. You got to monitor and find out what your mite levels are. And that's a very important thing to do. We used to say that, 3% was acceptable or 2% was acceptable. This past winter, I did a lot of work with a friend of mine's apiaries, and we've come to the conclusion that when you start getting anything over 0, you better be ready to do something. So waiting around and letting the mites out reproduce your ability to get in there and control them is a no good. And it's going to contribute to you losing colonies. So I would say first thing is you need to know what your mite levels are. And you need to be, ready to do something about it. And every beekeeper, in my opinion, ought to understand what tools are available to control varroa mites. They ought to not be getting their information off of YouTube, quite frankly. No offense, Kevin, but I mean, you got a lot of good stuff on YouTube, but a lot of stuff on YouTube is not worth its weight or doesn't apply to us in New Jersey. So you need to know your mite levels and you need to be prepared to act. You need to understand your controls and what the variables are that they are good at. For example, you're not going to put formic acid on when it's 90 degrees out. It's going to do more damage than good. But you have other options to use when the temperatures are in those high degrees. So, those are 2 things, and you got to be prepared to act. And in my opinion, 1 or 2 treatments a year, or actually not opinion, my experience, 1 or 2 treatments a year is no good. You're going to be doing more than that.
Mhm.
Keep your mite levels down to a level where they're not going to negatively economically affect you.
Okay, thank you. So number one priority at this time of year to prepare for winter
No.
is
You know
mites.
what time I get the light on?
No,
I know I don't turn it on during the day.
I'm not sure what that was, but Megan, you're muted, and Bob, you're also muted, and Kevin, you're muted. So I guess the only panelist I have right now who isn't muted is John.
Yeah, but that wasn't me.
So let's hear next from John.
Okay.
Landi, this is Ron. Can we ask a question to Tim?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Okay. I've been doing beekeeping about 6, 7 years, and we started testing in the beginning, and we used to do 1 or 2 mite levels, and that was it. Now we seem to be treating all year round.
Mhm.
We're doing it in the winter, we're doing it in the spring, we're doing it in the fall, we're doing it in late winter. Why do we have to treat? Why do we look for mite levels when we're going to treat anyway, regardless?
Because you want to know what your levels are, Ron.
But I'm still going. I'm treating no matter what. I mean, I'm using apple.
But Ron, wait a minute.
Yeah,
If
go
you
ahead.
don't know what your mite level is before you put a treatment on, and you don't know what it is after you put a treatment on, you have no idea if it was effective or not. So you might just be, swimming out in the deep end for no apparent reason. Follow that?
Yeah, but I'm going to treat them again anyway because I've been told now I'm going to treat 4 times a year. How many more times can I treat in a year? And it's always I'm using a different. I'm using formic acid. I'm using Apovar. I'm using Apogard. I'm using the acid. I'm using all different things at different times. How much more can I do? Can I do more than 4 times a year?
No, it's not that you're, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
Of course you can. You
Okay.
want to keep those mite levels down to 1 or 0.
No, I understand that. I truly understand that. Okay, I just asked a question. I appreciate
And
the answer.
Ron, without monitoring, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm the first one to admit the alcohol wash is not the best test in the world, but it's the best one we have. It's
Yeah.
the only one we have that is really efficient.
Okay. All right. I appreciate it. Thank you, Tim. Appreciate that.
Ron, another consideration is that if you don't do an alcohol wash before and after the treatment, you would never know if your bees, your mites have begun to develop any kind of resistance. So, maybe you've got a level of 3 after you did an alcohol wash.
Right.
Or after you did a mite treatment. So you do wash afterwards. Okay. You got a level of 3. Okay. So if you don't know what you had before, maybe you had 2 before, which tells you that, whatever you used to treat didn't work, period, because you got an increase in your levels. So
And
that's why the before and the after.
And then waiting till 3 months later to do it again, you're going to assume that the treatment worked, but it really didn't work, Ron.
Okay.
Now you're letting your mite population get way out of control. Your virus levels go through the roof, assuming that your mite treatment worked when in fact it didn't work, but you didn't know that because you didn't monitor the levels.
I got you now. Okay. I understand now. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll chime in on one thing too. What's making your hives sick if your hives are sick? You're not sure. Last year, I don't know why, single season, I had European foul brood in some of my hives. And it wasn't mite loads, it was European foul brood that made the mites or made the hives sick. If you don't know whether you do or don't have mites and your hives get sick, what caused it? It's just kind of background to know what's going on with your mite loads and understand the health of your colony, whether you do or don't treat for mites, test for mites, gives you information to make decisions on.
I agree. Thank you, Kevin. John, I was going to call on you a minute ago, and I know
Okay.
you
Good.
wash like every single one of those colonies.
Yeah, that's true. And if I'm in a colony, it only takes me a minute to do a mite wash. And I'm set up to do a couple at a time, so to speak. So if I'm already in a colony, I'm inspecting frames. I'll set a frame aside that's a good one to do a mite wash. So it literally doesn't take me any time at all. And oftentimes I'm surprised about what I see. Back to Tim's point, sometimes I'm expecting to see little or no mites, and I'll find a colony with high mites. And as Tim said, that tells me I've got to do something about it. But my short list of the primary factors that determine winter survival is the primary thing really is mites. You got to have low mites, as Tim said. Everybody knows. The second factor is a good fall cluster size. The reason that fall cluster has got a lot of winter bees in it, if not all winter bees. Third thing is a young, vigorous queen. And then, of course, they have plenty of food stores, both honey. Everybody counts honey, but nobody talks about pollen or bee bread reserves very much. And I think that's an important factor, too. And, we talk about mites, but, mites aren't what really kills the colony in the winter. It's the viruses that kill the colony in the winter. Looking at a recent research paper that talks about all the different viruses that honeybees can get, and really zeroes in on what they refer to as the paralysis virus complex, because there's 5-6 different viruses that cause paralysis. And if you think about it, that makes sense. A bee that has a paralysis virus can't use its wing muscles to heat the cluster, or maybe in a very limited way. While mites will weaken bees, that's for sure. It seems like it's really the viruses that kill them. So that's why, to prevent the viruses, you need to control the mites, and you need to control the mites early enough so that your winter bees don't get infected with the viruses.
Okay.
If the bees that are emerging in July and August now, they're really the bees that are going to start raising the winter bees. If those bees are infected with viruses, they'll transmit those viruses to the winter bees. And, that's a lot of beekeepers will go into winter with, healthy sized clusters, right? But they'll diminish pretty quickly because they can't stay warm in the winter. My thinking is really driven towards trying to minimize the viruses in a colony, and you do that by minimizing the mites. If you don't have mites, you're probably not going to have viruses. Back to Tim's point, if you don't know what your colonies are doing and you start having increased mites, you're going to have increased viruses, and it takes time for a colony to work through viruses if they've got a virus. I've heard everything from 6 generations of bees, for example, till they're cleaned up, and that's, you only have really 1 generation of winter bees. If they're loaded with viruses, it's going to be a problem.
Okay. Thank you, John. Just to interject what Grant mentioned to me over the phone, I asked him, do you have any words of wisdom you want me to pass on to the group? And his first thing was that he said, right now, you're treating for mites because you want those young, healthy bees, and a lot of them going into winter. And it makes me think of what Tim used to teach when Tim would come up and teach the pests and diseases segment of our short course in Essex. One of the things that he always was sure to mention is the fact that varroa mites damage the brood food glands of the young bees. So those nurse bees that are feeding the larvae that are going to become the wintering bees are being raised now. And if their brood food glands are damaged, they are unable to adequately feed those larvae. So you have poorly nourished bees going into winter. And one of the things that has been shown to be essential for bees lasting that 4 or 5 months that they need to stay alive to get to April, to get to March, is they've got to be very well nourished so that they have good fat bodies, those abdominal muscles that the mites attack, okay, and that's responsible for their longevity. So Bees that have been parasitized only live anywhere between 20 to 80% of the normal lifespan of a healthy honeybee. The average is 50%. So if you've got a winter bee that's got to live 5 months and she dies 2.5 months in, what happens to your winter cluster? It's non-existent. So viruses, young healthy bees is what Grant says. And he ended that, he said mites, mites, mites. Because in order to get those large volume of young healthy bees, you have to control mites now. Bob, you're muted. So unmute yourself. Meghan, you're muted too. So you got to unmute yourself. I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to hear from you next, Bob.
So I know we're going to talk a lot about mites through this whole thing. But to your point, Landi, I think the important thing is that it affects those winter bees and it makes them so that they can't live the 4 or 5 months through the winter. A pretty classic thing that I see with a lot of the new beekeepers that I mentor is they said, boy, I had a huge cluster going into winter. November, Thanksgiving, the bees were flying. It was great. Christmas, it was warm. Bees were flying again. All of a sudden, they get to that first week in February, and guess what? Their hive is dead. Yeah. And that's because the winter bees weren't long-lived enough to make it through the winter. And so the cluster just keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until they either freeze to death or they starve because they can't move to where the food is. Yeah. So that kind of leads me into what's the next thing that's really important, and that's, John alluded to this, is the food. You know, there's got to be enough honey. There's got to be enough pollen so that they can raise those brood and really start ramping up in the early spring. So those are the two big ones.
Thank you. Meghan, you're still muted.
I'm here. I mean, I echo everything that Bob and John and Kevin and Tim and even, you and Grant have said, especially with mites being so important, but also just feed. Calls or colonies that die coming out of winter, and people want to know why. And a lot of it is trying to figure out, well, what happened then? And so, okay, the bees couldn't move to the food. Well, they probably were weak going into winter, and ultimately it goes back to the varroa mites. But, you also just really need to make sure that you have plenty of food. So, like, I start feeding my bees as soon as I pull honey supers off, even though we're still in the middle of July, because I'd rather be prepared than be panicking in November saying, oh no, I need to put, I need them to get 20 pounds on in the next week. This isn't going to happen. So.
Okay, great. So that moves us into really the next important thing, which is food. And, Bob, what you were talking about, that winter kill of, just so everybody knows, that classic varroa kill, if you lose your bees over the winter and you're doing an autopsy in spring and you find thousands of dead bees on the bottom board and a little tiny fist-sized cluster left, okay, that with honey all around them, that's a classic varroa kill. That's exactly what if I can pick that up. If I see that, I know that, yeah, they starved to death, but no, they didn't freeze. It wasn't because they didn't have enough food. That's varroa. Varroa mites killed that colony. Let's talk about food. So we got two things going on here. We need carbohydrates and we need pollen. So they need protein because they've got to start raising brood back after the winter solstice. When the queen begins to lay again, they've got to feed that that young brood. So what do you guys do to get your bees heavy enough going into winter? And one thing I'd like you to address is the pulling of honey and how that ties in with feeding bees. A lot of new beekeepers don't pull the honey because they want to make sure they leave enough for the bees, but then they wind up having, 3-4 honey supers on hives in October from honey that never got pulled, and there isn't any honey in the brood nest, and it's all up here. So if you can talk about that a little bit. Tim, you want to start us off?
Sure. I live in a place where there is virtually no fall honey flow. We try to start pulling the honey by the middle of June.
Wow.
And we want it off by beginning of September. Now, when I was working, it was difficult to do that. Usually it went till the middle of September. But we would treat the bees that the honey got pulled from as soon as the honey got pulled from them. And then start feeding those bees syrup to get them heavy, because I can't count on a fall honey flow. One thing I learned over the course of 30 or 40 years is your bees got to be fat and you got to have big clusters. I remember one year back when varroa mites became resistant to apistan, and we started having to use Kumafos, which is a very bad pesticide, but it was the only thing that was available to kill the resistant bees or the resistant mites. And the problem was I didn't do a lot of feeding back then. I wasn't really prepared to be able to feed the bees well. So we got the mites knocked down in good order, but the clusters were so small, they were like this going into winter in September. And when you have a cluster that's only that big in September, I mean, that year we had like a 75% death loss. And I swore that would never happen again. And I geared myself up and made myself able to feed bees, feed them heavy, and get them fat. And the thing that we learned through all that was that feeding them syrup in July and August and even early September in an area where there is no fall crop is very good, because that also stimulates brood production, gets the queens laying, and gets me a large population of young, and if my mite treatments were on, non-parasitized, non-damaged bees going into the winter. And that is really key to overwintered survival. Large population of young bees that have not been damaged by varroa. All we knew was varroa back then, John. We didn't know that much about viruses in those days. But the two are coupled kind of together.
Absolutely.
Keeping the mite level low, you keep the viruses low, you get the colony fat, you stimulate the queen to lay, and you got a heavy colony. If any of you heard me speak before, if you don't grunt when you lift that second deep, not heavy enough. So, those are all important things as we move into the fall. And you know what? I like hive top feeders. I've done open feeding in my area because I know my colonies don't have disease, and that's a way that I could get feed on them quickly. That's what a lot of commercial guys do. Just because there's so many, you can't get them done. The other thing that my friend Grant always tells me is you got to start early pulling honey so you can get finished pulling honey before it's too late in the fall. You got to start to finish. So depending on how many colonies you have, you may have to start earlier than normal and give up some honey in order to get your honey off and your mite treatments on and your colonies fattened up for winter. So, but that's up to each individual beekeeper to make those judgment calls.
Landi, another question from Ron.
Yes, Ron.
Can you tell us what from all you guys, what do you use to feed your bees? Is it 1-to-1? Is it anything else? Do you add anything to it?
Yeah, Ron, what I always used was high fructose corn syrup. I know it's the bane of all the talk on the internet, but Harvey's Honey used it. Other beekeepers I know have used it. And you know what? I would thin that down so it's thinner and easier for the bees to take. I'd mix 50 gallons of water to 200 gallons of syrup, and the bees take it very readily. And you can fatten a colony up very quickly in August, early September using that kind of feed.
Thank you.
Meghan, you're muted again, but let me ask you one specific question before you tell us what you do with your bees. when Ron mentioned, when Tim mentioned high fructose corn syrup, you know, it's a very thick thing. And he's also talking about stimulating the queens to lay. So if you give them, for instance, very thick syrup early in the summer, that's really more for storage as opposed to it being like nectar, which stimulates the queens to lay. So would you recommend using early, or would you suggest they use a thinner syrup early in the summer?
For me, I use a thinner syrup in the summer so that it's still replicating that nectar flow that's coming in, so your queen continues to lay, so that you are getting those young, healthy bees to make it through the winter. And then usually sometime late summer, fall, I'll switch to 2-to-1, but that also depends on how much honey I've left on the colony. So if I'm already leaving, 50 pounds of honey on a colony, I probably don't need to switch to 2-to-1 until later in the season, as where if I leave a colony and they only have 20 pounds, I better switch to 2-to-1 a lot earlier. And so there's a lot of us with a lot of different experiences with our bees and stuff. And so a lot of this, you'll have to figure out what works in your operation with what your goals are for beekeeping. And if honey production is your number one goal, then you may take more honey off your bees and leave them with a little bit less and have to replace that with sugar water or high fructose syrup. And I know one of the questions was what type of feeding we use. I prefer the bucket feeders that sit on top of the colony on the inner entrance, inner cover, I mean. And I just like those because I can fill them up, walk them out to the colony and put them right there, and I don't have to go into the colony to do anything. So there's also a question in here about a mite treatment on the public chat.
Thank you. Oh, wow. We've got all kinds of comments here, and I'm remiss as your moderator because I haven't been reading them. Here's the question from Rosie. If Formic Pro is for cooler weather, what do we use for mites in this hot weather? Okay, that's a really good question. Kevin, would you like to address that one?
Sure. I wanted to use Formic Pro. I've been trying to move away from synthetic miticides of Apivar, just personal preference. This year, I wanted to do something different. I watched the weather, and if you're a beekeeper, you become a weather person. I looked at the weather and said, oh, I really wanted to treat my hives. I did some samples. I had some high mites, and every day their high mite loads, they need to be treated. So the storm blew through last Friday, and the temperature on my weather station went from 85 to 70. And I knew it was going to be a low of 60 something overnight with a high of only 82 the following day. Then the following day after that, it was supposed to be a high of 85. If you use Formic Pro, the catalog says you could use it up to, I think, 92 degrees.
Yeah.
But the higher it is, the harder it is to use it, because when you put it in such high heat, it absolutely nukes your hives. So I waited for a cool evening. I went out and put it on 70 degrees. It was 72. I added extra boxes. The only thing I didn't do, which I should have done, but I work for a living, so I didn't get a chance to do it, was freeze the stuff or put it in cold. Because when you make Formic Pro cold, it doesn't gas out as quickly. It's the heat that makes the product transform. So you have to look. Today was a great day. And if you can look, you almost always find that little opportunity to get 1 or 2 days in a row. Now that product has a 2-week lifespan when you put 2 pads on. And you want to be extremely careful in the first couple days, because most of the active ingredient releases in the heat for those first couple days, and then it kind of levels off and it finishes for the remainder of the product lifespan. So if you could find 3 to 4 days of reasonable temperatures, you can go ahead with a Formic Pro, but make sure you leave the entrances open, follow the directions, add extra boxes, and you should expect possibly some mortality because it's going to nuke some of the bees that are close to it. I also have acid mask. When you're putting this stuff on in hot weather, it's going to get you. And I wear my masks, and it worked perfectly. But chill the stuff. Now, the answer is if you can't find those warm days and you want to, or cool enough days to do it, what can you do? There's other things you could use. The obvious answer would be Apivar. You could put that in at any time. You have to make sure you pull your honey off. Formic can have honey. There's other options. I posted in the public chat a link to Honeybee Health Coalition Varroa Tools. If you're not familiar with that site, or if you haven't looked at it in a long time, go look at it. They take you through an algorithm where you answer the questions, and then they explain to you what your options are. And there's videos there. Like Tim said, YouTube University is great until you get on the wrong video and you follow the wrong advice. Yeah. Tim posted a video on how to do an alcohol wash. I filmed it. That's out on Northwest channel. That one you can trust. But go better to Varroa Tools, and they have all the videos done by that team. And you should be good to go to follow their wisdom. They're the gold standard for this stuff.
Kevin, Ron has a question. I'm just going to.
Landi, can I add something to what Kevin said?
Sure, go right ahead.
Yeah, but Kevin, on top of it all, everybody, you got to think your way through it too. You got to think about the weather conditions, the mite control, and you got to use common sense through the whole thing as well. That's all I wanted to say. Go ahead.
Okay. Ron is asking, why add boxes? Also, why do you use the 1 or 2 pad method for Formic Pro?
I've done both. I'll speak about why add boxes. You put that product in and you immediately hear a buzz. They react to it instantly, no matter whether the product is cold or not. And you need to give them a place to escape. On some of my hives, I have a slatted rack on the bottom to give them space to go to. But I put extra empty boxes with drawn foundation or drawn comb or foundation on top. And you're putting the pads in between the 2 brood boxes, and it gives the bees a place to go up and get away from the chemical and hang out. Or you'll see them come out and they'll beard. And in some extreme cases, if you don't provide them the space, they can abscond too because of the pressures of the chemical. So you want to add boxes to give them a place to hang out and get away from the chemical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Landi, I'll answer the question of 1 versus 2 pads. Similar question. The Gaut who makes the product, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but the 1 pad method, 1 pad for a week or 10 days, and then a second pad after that, versus 2 pads right away. The 2 pad treatment is more effective, kills more mites. And the reason for that is that with 2 pads, you have a higher concentration of formic acid in the hive. If you have 1 pad on, it's usually kind of towards the center of the colony. If you have 2 pads on, the instructions tell you to put it towards the outside. So that higher formic acid is really the only mite treatment that penetrates the brood cappings and kills the mites under the brood. And most of the mites actually are in the drone brood, right? Or at least that's what they prefer. The drones are typically around the perimeter of the hive. So if you have a 1 pad treatment, a lot of times the formic acid vapors are not strong enough to circulate to the perimeter of hive where the drones are and penetrate those cappings. So that really doesn't kill all the mites under the cappings, especially the drones around the perimeter. 2 pads definitely has a higher concentration of formic acid. It's high enough that it's able to penetrate all the brood, including the drone brood around the perimeter. And that's why it's more effective.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
I'll add to that too, is last year, the year before I used Mite Away quick strips that somebody local to me bought and they had extra. So I put it on my hives. I nuked one of my hives outright, just killed the whole thing.
Wow.
it was a Warre hive, and I put one pad in it, but apparently the dimension wasn't enough. But it made me gun shy for this. So last year when I used Formic, I did the one pad method, and my mite counts were okay, but I know the sentiment that John just shared. And this year I decided, you know, if I'm going to buy this product and I'm going to put it in, I want the full effect of it. So I went back to 2 pads and making sure that I put the extra boxes in, were hyper vigilant about the temperature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've found that the Formic Pro is a little easier on the bees than the Mite Away Quick Strips was. So the newer formulation, I think, is a bit gentler on the bees, and there's a little more leeway there. And before I forget, and we go to Bob's take on this, I want to answer Ron's original question about what else can you use if you don't have that window of time with temperatures below 85 degrees for the first 3 days of treatment. Apiguard is another option. Apiguard is a thymol gel, and it is a 1-month treatment period, but you can super immediately at the end of that time period. I think it's actually 26 to 32 days, and you have to go back once. So you put the gel on, and then you return 2 weeks later and put another dose of the gel on. The temperature range for Apiguard is, I believe, 60 degrees to 100 degrees, and they recommend a high of around 90. So it's a little bit more temperature tolerant than formic acid, and it's also quite effective. So you've got efficacies up around 95%, which is about the same as Formic Pro. So that's an option when the temperatures are this high. And instead of, if you put Apivar on, you're looking at a 2-month window. You've got a 6-week treatment period plus a 2-week waiting period before you can add honey supers, which not a consideration for Tim down south or for Meghan, because they're not going to get a fall flow. But up here, we often get a fall flow, and we'd like to have that honey from that fall flow. So if we've got 2 months where we can't have honey supers on, that's, that could be a problem for us. That can cost us some honey. Apiguard is an option. If you can't, if the temperature's a little too high for formic acid. Bob, you're muted, so you'll have to unmute yourself and then tell us what you do.
Actually, I would like to go back a little bit.
Okay.
And where I think we should have started this conversation is, when do the bees start preparing for winter? Okay, I think it's important to know what the bees are doing when. So the bees start preparing for winter at the solstice, right? The queen is at her maximum production then.
Yeah.
And it's very subtle, but she starts laying fewer and fewer eggs. The brood nest is contracting. So all of these things that we say we need to do, we need to think about them in the context of what are the bees doing and how can we help them with that?
Wow.
So we talked about feeding 1-to-1 to stimulate them. And that's important because the queen is, by nature, is slowing down and producing less brood. So if you want to get that big winter population of winter bees, you're going to need to feed when we hit the dearth. So that was just a point I wanted to make, was you need to understand what the bees are doing. Beekeeping is all about, what am I seeing? What does it mean? And what, if anything, should I be doing to help the bees? Right?
I'm going to jump on that too.
You have to understand what they're doing.
Been having a lot of conversations about the solstice, and we started rearing queens with the idea that the queens are going to come out after the solstice, and those queens are said to be better in the spring because they're young and vigorous. But 21 days to build a worker. And I live this plan where August 8th is D-Day for me. I want 4 cycles of 21 days, 84 days in total. And if I start August 8th, which is my sister's birthday, happy birthday, Dawn, it ends on October 31st. That allows me to have 4 cycles of bees. Now, the thing about August 8th is if you think about the way the bees ramp, they start in spring, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, they get to peak population. You know what really good peak population hives build? A lot of mites. And when does that happen? It tails just after peak population at the solstice. They have the most mites they're ever going to have.
Mhm.
I used to say July or August. We used to say August. Now we're saying July. We're almost to August, by the way. This is the time you need to get rid of your mites out of your hives. So on August 8th, you can have 4 cycles of healthy bees, back to what John was saying earlier, so that you get to Halloween and your hives are buttoned up November 1st. Now, I always had this idea that I was going to go till Thanksgiving. What happened in the last 2 years? November 1st, it got cold. You couldn't really do that much bee management. So I've rethought that and said, now my target is November 1st, full colonies. I go to maintenance mode November 1st with ideas of doing mite treatments mid to late November, like Thanksgiving. I'll do a mite, and if I need to, I'll do oxalic acid. And I credit Landi to this. A couple of years ago, I saw Landi speak in Philadelphia at the Beekeepers Guild, or maybe it was Chester. And she talked about your opportunities to monitor and treat and also work with your honey production and nectar flows and the harmony of what goes on to what Bob was saying about the season. And, you know, this is the time right now. You should be monitoring your mites and treating if you need it. You should have done it in the spring, hopefully, so you had low ramp up to that massive population. And you should get them in the fall just before you put them to bed. And those 4 cycles of clean bees are your winter bees. Put all that together in a life cycle, as Bob was saying, and your colonies likely will get through, barring any nasty events.
So let me just, the concept of getting the mites in the fall, maybe a little bit too late, if I could put it that way, because again, the viruses would have already infected the bees. So I know a lot of beekeepers rely on a fall treatment, and that fall treatment, they think that once they kill all the mites in the fall, they're good to go. But the issue is that the damage has already been done. The colony's already infected with viruses. So that's why I think about viruses as much as I think about mites. And again, if you've got the winter bees that were infected with viruses back in August, September, you know, a lot of the damage is already done. Now I'm saying and absolutely I treat in the fall, but that's a lot more for mites immigrating into the colony from collapsing colonies. So you got to take care of those. But again, the point is that you can't wait till the fall to treat. You've got to keep mite levels low all through the year. And I'm just not necessarily reacting exactly to what you said, Kevin, but oftentimes I hear beekeepers say, well, I'm just going to do a fall cleanup, with the assumption that if they have all their mites drop off all the bees in the fall, they're good to go. But then they still lose colonies, and they don't understand why. And, you know, from what I read, a lot of people think that it's because of the virus complex that's in the colonies. That the damage is already done.
It's a fair point, and I'm glad you brought this, because then I can expand on the fall treatment. Is something, again, I learned from Landi. In the fall, I have beehives all around my neighborhood. There's probably 50 hives within a mile radius. I'm already monitoring through the summer into fall all the way to November. I'm keeping my mite loads in check. But come November, when everybody else's hives who didn't get taken care of flood the neighborhood, they die, they abscond, they do whatever, and they're coming over to my yard, I don't want to be surprised in the spring going, what the heck happened, right? You do get that. Landi, you talked about it several years ago. In fall, sometimes your hive just all of a sudden has a high mite load because it came from whatever was going on in your neighborhood. So the fall touch-up is just to make sure that nobody sneaks in around the corner and gets you, you know, before you go into winter.
So, and touch-up, you know, I use Apivar in the fall because it's a long-lasting treatment. You can hit them with oxalic acid, and that'll knock the mites off that's on there. That's for sure. But 2 days later, they can find another colony to rob out and bring a bunch of mites back. So, and you can keep hitting them with oxalic acid, I guess. Let me go back to feeding for a little bit, and with one
John,
thought. Yeah.
Wait, but before you move on to that or go back to that, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. One, it harkens back to what Tim was saying earlier about 20 years ago, we would do one treatment a year and it was fine. And now we really can't do that anymore. The mites are more virulent, they are transmitting more viruses, and they just simply do more damage. So the threshold, this IPM threshold, which we used to try and find, is now down to 0. Just no mites are okay. And what Kevin was talking about with, November cleanup, this happened to me last year. I had treated coming out of winter, I treated in summer, and then I did the same thing that you did, John. I put Apivar on mid-September, thinking it was going to protect me through that vulnerable fall period where we get mite bound. Then at the end of October, I did my alcohol washes and found that I had about maybe 5%, 5 to 10% of the hives all of a sudden had numbers up around 10 and 20% mite infestation with the Apivar on. But it was the tail end of the treatment. And I'm thinking, okay, not very much active product in there on day 40 of the Apivar treatment. And this was the day that those bees went out and found a collapsing colony with a lot of mites, brought back some honey, brought back some mites. So I went around and did an oxalic acid vaporization cleanup treatment in November, when pretty much all those hives were virtually broodless. As Kevin pointed out, it got cold early on in November. And if they had one frame of brood, it was a lot. Most of them
Landi, why did you take it out after 42 days? Why didn't you leave it in for the full 56?
I did, but I'm just saying that the alcohol washes that I was doing at the end of October, at the end of the treatment, indicated I had high mite loads at that time. And I didn't need to take out the treatment, but it wasn't working. So, but just to finish what happened, I did the vaporization, completed the Apivar treatment, took it out at the right time, and every single one of those hives that had high alcohol wash numbers survived the winter. So it wasn't a situation where the mites had gotten into the brood and damaged the brood or transmitted viruses. They just hadn't been there that long, is what I'm guessing, because doing that vaporization cleaned them up, killed them, and the bees survived and they were fine. It's very interesting.
Yeah. So Landi, on the Apivar being less effective at the end of the treatment period, I asked Vita Pharma, the manufacturers, about that, and they claim that with the technology with the release strip, that the Amitraz releases pretty much continuously all through that 56 days. That it doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't tail off. And that I'm just sharing what they claim. So I was kind of under the assumption too that it gets weaker and weaker, but they say not.
I don't know. Meghan, do you believe that? You're muted.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like John has had a lot of interactions with the chemical companies, quizzing them at different conventions and stuff.
That'd be true.
Hey, I've seen him hassling some people over at NOD. You got those hard questions. Put them on the spot,
Hopefully in a nice way, though.
yeah. But, you can ask them, and I don't know. I don't actually know the answer to that, but I always leave it on for the longest amount of time. I don't know.
Yeah. John, I've asked them too and had them hem and haw on that exact question. and
Yeah, I
and
guess my
say,
my
well,
information
it'd be nice
comes
to
from
set up an experiment.
yeah, the I can't remember her name now, but she's the technical director. That's where I got my information. So
Well, I
you know,
probably shouldn't mention the name of the guy that kind of hemmed and hawed and said, well,
yeah,
we should do more work on that.
yeah, sometimes you got to consider the source.
Yeah, but his initials are FP. If that tells you who it is.
Well, I was guessing the other guy, but okay.
Okay. Tim, what do you think about this, about the efficacy of Apivar toward the end of the treatment period? And you are muted, so you're going to have to unmute to comment. Tim?
You're still muted, Tim. There you go.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it that that we've seen problems with its performance. You know, is that the efficacy of the product, or is that the mites becoming resistant to the product? Is that because of the misuse of certain people using those products and never changing those products up? I really don't know. It's like I said in the beginning when you gave me the opportunity to open up, you can't assume anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think far too many beekeepers think that just because a mite control product is sold in a bee supply catalog, it's effective. And that is not true in any way, shape, or form. So, you know, I saw a post earlier on this chat that they can't even get Apiguard now. And Apiguard would have been my go-to this time of year when it's hot and humid and sticky out, because it don't harm the bees as much as some of these other things do. But if you can't buy it, you've got to use something else.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know what, I think Apiguard has its place. But I really think that you need, I mean, back to Ron's question, I think it was Ron's question, you know, 45 minutes ago. Why test for mites before and after you treat? It's so you can know if whatever treatment you used was effective during that time of the year. You know, in the old days, we used to have mite controls and there'd just be red mites all over the bottom board. That's how good they worked. And then those hard, quote unquote, hard chemical treatments were not effective anymore because the mites developed resistance. Then we went into these more natural ones like Apiguard and Apilife VAR and, you know, all these other ones, and they're very sketchy and very temperamental, highly dependent upon temperature and humidity. And if those things aren't right, as well as the application time, in my experience, they were not very effective. But there's still a tool that will knock some mites down. But you can't assume that you're getting a whole cleanup in July because you put Apiguard on or Apilife VAR or whatever it is. You have to continue to monitor and see just how good a job it did. I'm a proponent of using all those materials because if I have a mite population in my apiary that Apiguard is not really working that well on for me, then maybe I need to hit them with something else, but also use Apiguard as a tool at different times of the year, depending on the conditions. That's why, you know, I've said for many years, beekeeping is a thinking person's hobby or business. It's not for people who don't want to think about these things. You know, I talk to my beekeeping friends about these things all the time. I think about these things all the time. Even after brain surgery, I still think about these things. and I want to know what other people are seeing and other people are finding. So, you know, you got to keep on it. You can't give up.
And so then thinking about it too, you know, part of the thinking is that there's risks and benefits with any of these treatments. And, you know, well, let me stick with Formic Pro, for example. I mean, the higher the temperature, the bigger the risk. But, you know, I've got some colonies that are high in mites. So, you know, it may be beneficial to take that risk whenever the colonies are high, because I know it's going to knock them down pretty effectively this time of year. if I don't do anything, I might lose them anyway, kind of thing. The other thing is with benefits and risks, a lot of people don't want to use formic because they're afraid of bee losses and queen losses. And it's certainly a risk. But again, what I've found is that it's really the bees that were going to die anyway, the sick bees. Those are probably the bees that are dying. And my experience, again, years really with Formic Pro is that it doesn't kill young queens, hardly ever kills young queens. It's only the older queens that are killed. So, when I'm using Formic Pro, after the treatment period, I'm checking to see if the colony's queen right or not. And if it's not, I'm ready to requeen. In fact, part of the strategy I have for getting colonies through winter is to requeen in the fall. Bob and Kevin talked about that a little bit too. In the beginning, I'd hold on to the queen as long as that's a good queen, laid a lot of beautiful brood pattern, hive made a lot of honey, right? Goes through the winter and comes out in the spring, and she doesn't do much. And there's, I think, two reasons for that, right? The queen only has so many eggs that she can lay. So she's been laying eggs like crazy. She's going to be running out. And that she also does not produce as much brood in the fall. So you don't have as many winter bees. They don't build up as quickly in the spring. I've found that a fall queen, a fall queen will lay more eggs in the September, October timeframe that generally have bigger clusters. And of course, those are winter bees. They'll continue laying later than an older queen. And those are winter bees again. They'll have bigger clusters in the spring. So, and, theoretically, they're less likely to swarm in the spring. This year, I saw plenty of colonies with young queens swarm, though, too. But, right now, I've got queens ready to go to their new assignment whenever they need to. And just because a queen may have made it through with the Formic Pro, wasn't killed and so forth, but, she might get replaced anyway. I'm pretty brutal. I think it was Brother Adam that said you got to be ruthless as far as replacing queens. And I've become ruthless. I don't have any attachment to queens at all. Other than I will follow a couple queens, a few that I think might make good breeder queens for the next time around, because breeder queens don't last forever either. So if I've got a queen that's maybe overwintered twice, a good honey producer, general, and so forth, I'll start raising queens from that line then. So, but that's really the only exception. Otherwise, I get a new assignment.
Ron, if I hadn't done the alcohol washes at the end of the Apivar treatment, I would not have known about that 5 to 10% of colonies that had gotten mite bombed. And I wouldn't have known that I needed to do an additional treatment in November. I could have just assumed that my Apivar worked and everything was fine, but because I didn't make that assumption, I came out of the winter with better than 98% survival. And it was because I tested. So that highlights the importance of testing. And I have to thank Kevin and Meghan for answering people's questions here in the chat, because I've been very remiss about it. It's hard for me to listen to you guys and really focus and concentrate on what you're saying, and also read what's going on in the chat. I'm getting too old to do both of those things at the same time. So thanks to the two of you for answering these questions that are coming up here. Bob, I want to hear from you, and I particularly want to hear from you about one issue that we haven't really talked about yet, which is leaving honey supers on the hives for the bees, not taking them off. Okay, maybe you treat with Formic Pro, so you can do a treatment with the honey supers on, But then come winter, you've got a couple of double deeps and most of your honey is up high. Maybe you've got 3 honey supers up there. What do you think about that? How do you feel about that practice?
Well, we all know that the bees don't heat the whole hive; they just heat the cluster. But they have to have access to the food. I think leaving one extra super on there is okay. I had a situation last year where I have a yard that I'm running all mediums, Landi, and I had a 4th medium on there, right? And so I harvested what was there, and then I put the wet super back on, and when I went to take it off, it was full of bees again. So I just left it, and it didn't seem to have an effect on any of the bees. But I could see where, taking honey is that's where the thinking comes in, right? You don't want to take too much, but you want to leave enough, but you don't want to leave too much. So what is that? And that's really what it's all about. While I have the floor, I would like to talk about mite sampling, the alcohol wash.
Okay.
A little tip that I've found that works for me is I do my initial alcohol wash. I count my mites that are there, and then I pour that alcohol through a strainer to take the mites out, put the alcohol back, and shake it again. And guess what? Almost always get more mites with that second shake. So what I've taken to doing now is I will keep washing until I get 0 mites. In other words, say I get 2 the first time, and I take the 2 out, I shake it up, and I get another one. Now I have 3. I shake it again until I have none, because you're not getting them all. Again, it's the best test we have, but it's not perfect. And I just think, again, just if you have something to pour them in to get it out, just to make sure you get them all.
Yeah, it's a great idea. If you have any alcohol at all these days.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I'm very lucky because my son actually bought me as a gift a gallon of 90% alcohol. He knew I used it in my beekeeping operation, and I think he gave it to me as a Christmas present. So I've got alcohol to do my alcohol washes, at least for this year. I don't know about next year, but it's working now.
Yeah, I've been using windshield wiper fluid.
Me too.
Yeah.
I find the Rain-X stuff isn't so good because it's yellow orange and you can't see the mites so good. You got to use the blue stuff.
Guys, let me just add one thing to that. If you have any alcohol at all, when Medhat was doing his study last year with me, he would add about a pint of rubbing alcohol to the windshield washer fluid, and we were getting much better results with that. So if you can get a little bit, you can stretch it out by adding it to the windshield washer fluid, and it will actually give you a better result than just windshield washer fluid alone.
That's good to know.
And if you're using windshield washer fluid, it's important to do what Bob's saying is, shake it a few times to see what the real counts are, because it's hard to shake the mites out with the windshield washer fluid.
Yeah, I hate that it takes much longer to kill the bees. The poor bees are drowning in that stuff. It makes me feel awful.
Landi, I am going to have to leave in a few minutes. I thought it was going to be over at 8 o'clock. Sorry.
You got any last words for us?
8:03 now. Pardon me.
Okay. You got any last words of wisdom for us before you go?
I share the thought on food, and I mentioned it before, and we talked about syrup and so forth, feeding with syrup. The other thing the bees need to raise brood, though, is protein, pollen. But a lot of times, and even around here, I can have yards that have plenty of pollen coming in, and there's other yards that's not that far away, and they don't have much pollen coming in. You need to look in the frames to see how much bee bread's in the hive. You can feed them a lot, but if they don't have pollen, they're not going to raise brood. They need that. They need a protein source. So I usually keep a pollen feeder out in the yard, and whenever I see the bees start picking up interest in that again. I put a little bit more in, and so
Mhm.
they'll bring that pollen substitute back to the hive. They'll store that away like bee bread, and especially in the fall goldenrod time period. Yeah, there's plenty of pollen coming in, but then you go into a pollen dearth. So that pollen coming in also stimulates brood rearing. So
Okay,
I'll share that thought.
thank you very much.
I'd like to know what everybody thinks about feeding pollen in the fall, because I've read and I've been told that it's the lack of pollen coming in that stimulates the bees to produce the winter bees. Has anybody else heard that?
I haven't, but I find that very interesting. And I never feed pollen in the fall. But if I go
I
and look,
regularly feed pollen in the fall, and haven't seen any issue at all with
Okay.
clusters of winter bees.
ask
You know,
Temperature
I'm
Beekeepers.
the
That's why I asked.
yeah. And again, I'm looking for, if they don't need to consume it for the brood, they'll store it away, and they'll actually consume it during the winter then too.
Mhm.
And I think it comes back to your point too, Bob, about when did the bees start preparing for the winter? Well, they're continually trying to pack away bee bread as well, and as well as honey. So I don't know. I had that concern with feeding pollen, but doesn't seem to be an issue at all for my bees.
Okay. Fair enough.
Very interesting. Very interesting. If I go and look in my hives of the 3 mediums, like just ready to go into the winter, that bottom medium is almost always packed with bee bread.
Yeah.
They store pollen down there, and the only time I feed pollen is in late winter when I'm giving them fondant, like in late February, March, just to make sure that it's insurance really. Most of the time they're fine, but it's insurance to make sure that they've got enough food to get into, to dandelions. But just as insurance, I'll give them a pollen patty just to make sure they've got enough to raise
So
brood.
thinking through that a little bit about, if pollen, the incoming pollen would not allow them to raise winter bees. I mean, in the fall, there's a lot of pollen coming in the fall when they're raising winter
Asters,
bees, right?
goldenrod.
So it doesn't seem to be, if they were strutting off raising winter bees when there's pollen coming in, that would occur in, September, October timeframe, right? So
That's true.
seems to be contrary to what I see too.
Anybody else got any observations on that?
There does seem to be like a light switch. You could look out at goldenrod. It looks beautiful and yellow, but it's not till the plant matures that it's actually providing food. And then it immediately just shuts off and it's done. And after goldenrod, there's not a lot out there. And I think the combination of that mass amount just tapering off very quickly and the temperatures get to what Bob is alluding to, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So anything else that we need to cover? We've talked about food. I still have something to say about those supers on the hives. And Bob, we're talking about mediums. You got a yard now of mediums. I would say about 10% of all of my hives go into winter with 4 mediums, just because those colonies are so big that they don't fit in 3 mediums. They need that extra box. And that's fine. I have no problem with wintering them in 4 if that's what they need. But I see new beekeepers make what, in my opinion, is a mistake, which is to leave all of the honey supers on because they feel they're being generous, right? They want to leave that honey for the bees, when if they would be better off pulling the honey, doing the mite treatment, and doing the stimulative feeding of syrup in summer to get the queen to lay that nice healthy brood, rather than just having the bees sit there with all the honey that they gathered in spring. And then the food is in the brood nest. It's down there in the double deeps or the 3 mediums where the bees have immediate access to it where the cluster is. So they don't have to break cluster to go upstairs and find their food, when there's nothing in the brood nest. Plus, having all that extra equipment on the hives in winter, the cluster is heating only the cluster, but they are losing heat by radiation from the surface of the cluster. And the larger the container that cluster is in, the greater the radiation loss. So leaving too many boxes on the bees in winter actually costs them in terms of an energy problem. They're using more energy. They're not heating that area, but they're losing heat to it. So, one thing for our new beekeepers, I want to caution them, instead of, you're not doing the bees any favors by not pulling your honey. Take your surplus honey, make sure you're not like taking the one honey super and the box below is empty. That's not okay. Okay, but take your honey super, make sure that top box, whether it's a deep or a medium, is nice and full of honey. You should grunt when you try and lift it. And then do the recommended mite treatment and the stimulative feeding to get the queen to lay young, healthy brood, get all those young, healthy bees, and go into winter with your double deep or, your 3 mediums, maybe 4. Yeah, that's just the point I wanted to make. Okay, anybody else got any last words? I think we're coming up here to about an hour and a half. Kevin.
I wanted to mention something that I don't think beekeepers pay enough attention to. This year, I've been doing a comb purge. I've been doing beekeeping for 12 years. Last year, actually, I made a concerted effort. Any dead outs that I had and anything that had old comb. But what you should be doing now, a recommendation is, if you have crappy comb, poorly formed comb, lots of drone comb, as you're doing your inspections, move it to the outside and eventually get it into the bottom box if you can. And when the cluster moves up in the fall or in the spring and that bottom box is empty, to start your new seasons, you can get all that stuff out. Now is the time to start rearranging your brood nests and your comb. Keep moving your bad comb to the outside or whatever comb that, whatever place the bees are not favoring. Focus on food, population, pattern. And I think another thing that you should be doing is making sure that through the summer, you're inspecting your queens. If you're not following the guidance that John gave earlier, which is make sure you have young, vigorous queens that aren't going to do you wrong. If you have an older queen and it fails late in the season and you start seeing bullet drone, what are you going to do? Can't get a queen in October or November. If you could find that queen is past her prime or starting to slow down and having problems where she's become a drone layer or so on in September and October, you're in far better shape than mid-October to November. So if you have older queens, make sure you're watching your patterns and make sure that they're good for building your winter bees. Food population pattern is the way I always look at that.
Great. Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any last words that you'd like to add before we sign off for the evening?
I think going off of what Kevin said, if you are a new beekeeper and you purchased a nuke, that would be a good time to potentially rotate out the frames that came on your nuke. Because you never know how old those frames are. You don't know what they came with. So it's just one of those things to consider. And then, Landi, there's 2 more questions. One about oxalic in November and when the goldenrod flow is.
Okay, I just answered the goldenrod flow.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, while Kevin was talking, I actually split my focus a little bit and tried to read those questions.
I had frames from 1995, by the way. That was the number on them. They came from nukes. Some from the year 2000. That's all some of this stuff. If you see anything that says GJS,
my operation, I have to admit.
GJS.
Okay.
Schaefer.
Oh wow. Okay. All right. Do we have any
Can
more
I say
questions
something?
here? Sorry,
Landi.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Tim?
this is Tim.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to extend me and my family's thanks for everybody that prayed for us, that sent healing vibes, that was thinking of us as we've been going through this whole situation with me. And we are very thankful for the love and the concern that we've gotten from the beekeeping industry in New Jersey. And I just wanted to extend thanks to all those that are listening tonight or are watching this. I have to have another surgery the end of August to remove the metal out of my skull. And they're going to put this special prosthetic device in there. And it's going to be on August 26th. So it's with the same people that saved my life. And I just want to thank you all for all of your support and just tell you that it's still a road that we're traveling. And I'm always happy to get phone calls and emails from people. So thank you.
Tim, I think I can say with great confidence on behalf of all of the Essex beekeepers and probably all of the beekeepers in the state that we're the ones who are grateful to you. You know, you have been so generous with your time and your knowledge and your experience over the years that, you know, and you've been a friend to every one of us here. So it's, you know, the thanks is ours, and we will continue to, you know, to send all those good vibes and hug trees and send prayers and good thoughts. And we'll be with you on August 26th. All right, everybody, it's been a great meeting. Thank you so much for coming. I think this has just been a wonderful panel. I'm sorry we missed Grant. I know he would have had a lot of interesting things to add to this discussion. As it is, he's just going to have to watch the video after the fact and add those spicy, interesting things on his own. He can tell Peta all about it. But have a great day, guys, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks for coming. Good night.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody. Good seeing everybody. Thanks. Bye.
Good night.